Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I talked with Brendan Lee, a teacher and host of the Knowledge for Teachers podcast. The impetus for this conversation was a blog Brendan published on his Substack titled Engineering the Aha When Discovery Learning Actually Works. In that blog post, Brendan wrote about a sort of engineered discovery, creating precise conditions and structure to ensure students have those valuable aha moments of learning. With that as a backdrop, we talked about the instructional hierarchy, building fluency, and more details that I won't delay getting to our rich conversation with. As always, please visit our website, wegrowteachers.com, to learn more about our professional learning, which is always focused through the lens of knowledge-rich inquiry. Early bird registration for our summer project-based learning professional learning event, PBL Grow 26, ends at the end of February, and cohort 1 is nearly full. So if you're interested in joining us at Louisville's beautiful waterfront botanical gardens in June, I'd suggest registering sooner rather than later. As always, you can email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org or find more information at wegrowteachers.com. And now here's my conversation with Brendan. I'm with Brendan Lee, and we're going to talk about his work in teaching and learning and thinking, and especially one of the pieces that he published, I think, on his Substack about discovery learning, which is probably antithetical to a lot of the people who think and work in cognitive science, of which I would account in that bucket. But as I usually like to do, Brendan, I want to welcome you to the podcast and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and give a little background so people know who they are listening to.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Drew. It's I've definitely listened to a number of your previous episodes, and I appreciate the fact that you're willing to get people on who maybe have different views to yourself and other people that you've had on, and so more than happy to talk about these things. I think that's really why we have issues in education, is that people just talking past each other, not actually talking to each other. And so look, my background, I know you kind of linked me up to some of the cognitive science people that you've spoken to previously, but I'm just a teacher, right?
Just a teacher
who I started out as a high school PE teacher, and my whole kind of background was I grew up wanting to make it as a professional athlete. We have a sport over here in Australia called rugby league, and that was my sport that I was trying to make it in, and so naturally, like I'm sure it's similar around the world. Like if you love sport, you haven't really got many career paths that you can kind of go down. It's either like a physio, personal trainer, or a PE teacher. So I became a PE teacher, and I definitely loved that. But there was this point in my career, and I went through that sort of emotional roller coaster that a lot of teachers go through, right? Where I was torn, where there were parts of me that absolutely loved what I did, but then there were other parts that were just extremely frustrated. So frustrated with a lot of that external things that you don't really have a lot of control over. So things to do with the system, the school, other people, and I let it get to me. And I actually left teaching for a couple of years and opened up a cafe. And sorry for another day, but you learn a lot of things about yourself when you do something like that. And eventually, I had this pull, this sense that I had unfinished business in education. And part of the reason why I left was just feeling that frustration with the amount of students entering year 7, secondary school here in Australia, and they were already disengaged from learning. So they were already telling themselves that school wasn't for them. And it just really got to me at that point. And so I wanted to see what was happening at the other end. And so I re-entered the profession as a primary teacher. And we're just touching on some cognitive biases before we started recording. And one of the cognitive biases that got me right then, and it got me also when I opened up the cafe, was that Dunning-Kruger effect, where you think you know more than you do, right? And so I thought, how hard can it be to open up a cafe, and serve a couple of coffees? and then I thought, how hard can it be to teach a bunch of 9 and 10-year-olds? I've been teaching teenagers my whole life.
Yeah.
And and that was exactly one of those real humbling experiences where you soon realize I've got absolutely no idea what I'm doing here. And so essentially, like, from there, because I entered with this mindset of like, I just want to learn how to teach effectively, reading, writing, and and maths and things like that. And like, really, I actually went in with the thinking that what was all I needed to do was students at that kind of age group, they needed to be learning more skills and knowledge and about topics to do with the real world. Yeah. And so like, I actually started, if you kind of trying to pigeonhole people, I probably started more as someone who I thought, project-based learning that was exactly what was needed, and so that was kind of the pocket that I was in, right? And then as I started to just learn more, especially like, and I think this is also important, that there are certain approaches which are going to be needed at different stages, depending on where the students are actually at. And so in the primary space, like, they do need a lot of those foundational skills and bits of knowledge. They haven't got it yet. And that was really what was missing from my thinking at that point in time. And and it's where you suffer from the curse of knowledge, right? Where you forget how hard it is to learn a lot of those things when you already know it. And so, things like reading, if we just kind of leave that up for chance, and at that point, like, a lot of the strategies that were being used were basically doing that, where we were kind of more hoping, like, I'm not sure if you've spent much time in primary classrooms, Drew, but there's like one of the kind of real popular techniques has been, and look, unfortunately, it's still being used in a lot of classrooms now, is it's kind of like these literacy group rotations. And so what happens is you have a group of students with the teacher, and so the teacher's either listening to them read or asking them some questions, getting them to do an activity, and then you've got all these other groups around the room who you've set up. Some of them, those activities, you've kind of tried to be intentional with what's happening there, but in the realities of teacher life, right, is that you had enough time to set up 2 or 3 of those properly, and then you've got 1 or 2 that are just like, just as long as you're busy, you stay out of my hair, I don't really care what you're doing, sort of thing. And
right.
Yeah, and as I tried that, and your intentions are you just want to do the right thing, but it didn't sit right with me, because within me, I knew there wasn't a lot of learning happening. I didn't really know what I was doing. I had no idea what most of those students in those groups were doing. And so that's really like, one of those moments that prompted me to just start asking more questions. And like a lot of people here in Australia, I probably came across like the science of reading sort of world initially, because of that exact reason of I just felt like things weren't working. And then eventually, after finding that there was a lot of information out there for how to teach reading effectively, I just started asking more questions about a bit more broader around, well, what does this look like in other subjects? What does it actually mean to learn something? And that sort of question, I sat with that question for such a long period of time. And the more you dig deep, I'm sure you've done the same thing, right? The digger you deep, the more complex it gets. It's like, it's not that simple. And then as I learned more and more, I just started asking more questions. And every time you feel like you're getting your head around something, then you come across an idea. And that's why I produced that latest article that you've got in touch with me about. You come across an idea and you're like, geez, I thought I knew some stuff, and now it's like, oh, there's still so much more to kind of dig into. So I guess that's kind of my story. Yeah.
Well, thanks for all that. so several threads. I wrote down a couple things while you were talking that we can pull on. I'm curious though, before I ask you, because I'd like a little bit more context and background on who you are and sort of your educational experience. But you mentioned the science of reading, and I'm curious how you first heard about it. I mean, here in the States, the Sold a Story with Emily Hanford has really, got the attention of a lot of people. I had her on the podcast as part of a reading panel. Boy, I don't know, it's been several years now. And I do think it's really, really important. And I think there's some really important differences between the teaching of reading and teaching of other things, as I'm sure you would agree. And I always tell people, like, I'm a big advocate of inquiry, but reading is not where you need to be using that kind of thing. So I'm curious, how did that, I guess, science of reading really sort of come on your radar?
Yeah, funny story, Drew. Like a lot of things, when you don't know what you're doing, who do you go to? You go to mum or dad, right? And so for me at that point, fortunately, like my mum, she was a deputy principal at a primary school, so she did actually have a bit of an idea about what she was talking about. And so I asked her, and it was pretty much just like, look, Mum, I need some help here. I've got no idea what I'm doing. Can you kind of point me in the right direction? And she asked some of her kind of knowledgeable teachers, and so at that point in time, she gave me a couple of key books that were quite transformative for me. Lynn Stone's Reading for Life. So Lynn's from Australia, and she wrote this book, which is quite a good entry level text. For people that don't know much about how to teach reading effectively. And then the other one was The Writing Revolution from Judith Hochman and Natalie Wexler. And so those two texts in particular, alongside a bunch of others, but they kind of just opened up my world to the fact that there is all this research out there. Whereas in my previous life as a teacher, as a high school teacher, I had no idea about this sort of research, and that it was accessible to teachers. And so that was really helpful. And basically, like, once you kind of learn a little bit and you start digging a bit deeper, like at the time, there was, on social media, there were quite a few people that made it accessible. So you could jump on. In Australia, we had a couple of great Facebook groups. There were people on Twitter. We probably, like, in terms of Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast, like we probably had people who were advocating for that stuff before that podcast. So it kind of came in a bit after. And look, I definitely want to say, like, our perspective in Australia is that it's more than phonics. I know that sometimes it can be pigeonholed as the science of reading is just phonics, but right. I think most educators here are definitely understanding that, like, that's just one small aspect of how to teach reading effectively.
Yeah. And Natalie Wexler was a part of that reading panel. And if anybody's interested, you can go back and listen to it and search our site for it, that kind of thing. And Natalie's actually, she was on here with me again 2-3 weeks ago. And unfortunately, I forgot to press record on the video on that one. So it's just the audio, but that be as it may. What was your experience like as a student, like K-12, your pre-college, that kind of thing? Was it more traditional? Was it more something a little bit more inquiry, progressive, constructivist, that kind of thing, or a mix? Or how would you describe it?
Look, probably, I guess, reflecting back, a bit more traditional. There were some teachers that they probably were trying to do a bit of inquiry. But like for me, I was just a battler of a student. I wasn't that super nerdy kid that knew everything really easily. As I mentioned before, my sole focus when I was at school was just sport, and so I tried hard in class. Nothing came easy for me, and like looking back, it was probably for a number of reasons where teachers were, rather than kind of teaching me specific things, it was more just kind of hoping that things would stick. And look, I enjoyed my time at school, and but it's looking back now, it wasn't like I had a lot of really effective teachers, regardless of what approach they were trying to use. And I think even now, like, that's probably more the space that I see teachers sitting in, is that it's not necessarily they're taking one sort of pedagogical approach as that's their style, right? It's more that they're trying different things, but it's not that they're actually doing any of those things really effectively and understanding the why behind it. And you know, similar to yourself, like I now run a lot of professional learning, and that's really what I'm focused on, is just ensuring that teachers understand the why behind what they do, so that they actually, you know, they've got this big toolkit, but knowing when to use those tools is the important part. It's not like, you know, I'm not all about like adding on more tools to your tool belt, right? But it's actually know when you need to pull the drill out, when you need to pull the hammer out, and how you're going to actually use that effectively as well.
Yeah, so the piece that you mentioned that got my attention and why I reached out is from February 3rd, and it's on your Substack. We'll put it in the link in the show notes, but it's at knowledgeforteachers.substack.com. And the title is Engineering the Aha When Discovery Learning Actually Works, which you sort of start off and say, wait a minute, has Brennan lost his mind? In reference, Paul Kirshner and Sweller, who will have been the guest or the focus of the podcast published before this one. And, his sort of famous or infamous paper, Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Does Not Work. And what I thought was interesting is, well, several things. One, you mentioned, and something that I think is really important, you've already mentioned it here a little bit already, is like, how do we sort of get past the sort of binary, us versus them, binary thinking of this is rigid, narrow, this is what's right, and this is what we do. And I spend way too much time on social media sometimes, trying to sort of poke and prod, and partly because I'm trying to understand people. But it just strikes me as an endemic problem that is education, but politics and, all this sort of culture war stuff, right? We're all, not all of us, but many of us it seems like we're in this sort of trance of, I've got my tribe and you've got your tribe, and I've got to try and figure out, how do I, get you over to this tribe or defeat you, or whatever the case may be. And so widening that aperture is something that I'm really interested in, and you kind of get at that. And it also resonates with some of the things I had a conversation with Barbara Oakley, and she actually, I don't know if you'd listened to it, but she actually articulated kind of the same thing that you wrote about here. So maybe why don't you give us sort of the elevator pitch for what you wrote about here in terms of when discovery learning, quote unquote, actually works?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I guess the elevator pitch would be, is that, like, firstly, if we the framework that I kind of operate from is the instructional hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And so that was developed from Haring and Eaton in 1978. And yeah, I found this just really helpful in terms of it breaks down that novice to expert continuum in mm-hmm. A bit more detail, because I found, that novice to expert continuum can be a bit abstract. It's like, like surface level, I think we get the difference between a novice and expert. And, when you're teaching someone who's closer to that novice end or an expert end, we're gonna position our instructions differently, right? But where I find it's not as helpful is that, like, if you're a classroom teacher, well, how do you know exactly where students are at, and what should we be doing if they're closer to that novice end of the spectrum versus expert? And so the instructional hierarchy actually gives us some observational look-fors, and both formatively and summatively, like where there's actual data, and a lot of people who do look at research and come from, I guess that sort of science of reading space, and they might be using things like Dibbles to assess, and they probably don't realize, but that's actually placing students along that sort of instructional hierarchy, and it tells us what stage of learning they're at based on the results that we can get. So things like fluency assessments, we can use that data to tell us, like, are they at that frustrational stage, which is that acquisition stage of learning, or are they at that stage of fluency? And so I'm telling you this more just so that we've got like a shared understanding as to like where I'm coming from before I kind of go into what I was speaking about in the article, because like one of the important things is just to understand that like if you've got students at that acquisition stage of learning, and I just touched on how it is also called that frustrational stage. If they are there, right, and we don't give them what they need at that point in time, then that's how they feel. They feel frustrated. And you'll see it on the faces of your students in the classroom. They will outwardly display that sort of disengaged learning behavior because it's just not working for them. And so like one of the things that we know is that if you're turning up to a class and day in, day out, all you're experiencing is failure, it doesn't feel good. And so what ends up happening is that you tell yourself, and often this happens in a class like maths, where as a teacher you feel like you've got such a full curriculum, and so you just keep moving on. You're pushing on. Next lesson, we're going to keep going, even regardless of the fact that we've left students behind. And so then these students that we've left behind, they keep experiencing that. And so then by the time they get to even grade 2, 3, 4, like they are struggling. They haven't got, firstly, they didn't get that accuracy in the initial lessons. And this kind of comes back to what I was talking about before, is that even those teachers who maybe they are saying that they teach explicitly, a lot of the times they're not doing it in an effective manner. Okay. And so we're not getting to that point where students are showing them that they understand what the teacher's trying to teach them. They're not getting to a level of independence where they can do things by themselves. So if we're at that acquisition stage of learning, we actually want to go through that gradual release of responsibility so that students have a high level of scaffolding. And then we're going to fade that away until they can do it independently. And we do that because it's just the most effective and efficient way of getting a message across. And then if we can do it at that point, like, and I'm starting to get towards that contingency adaptation stuff now, but if we can do it to that point, right, then we actually end up getting more time in the future to do, more of those sorts of inquiry-based activities that we might be aiming for. And so, yeah, if that's the goal, and I think like for most teachers, like actual teachers in the classroom, that is their goal, where they do want their students to have knowledge and skills that is useful to them. And like I said right at the start, like that's what my intentions were when I re-entered as a primary teacher. Was I feel like we've got to help them make more connections to the real world. And so I still believe that, right? But I guess what's shifted in my thinking is just how do we get there? And so now, how I currently think is that we've got to make sure that at the start we're getting that accuracy in our lessons, so we're not wasting our time, which is probably where a lot of our lessons are kind of sitting right now, is that students actually aren't getting that level of accuracy in the first place, where either teachers are keeping that scaffolding and prompting up for too long, and so students don't get out of that at all. And that might be because the teacher doesn't know what to do when they release, and so they keep teaching. And you see it all the time where the teachers their intentions are to release the students for independent practice, and then the last thing they say before they do it, or even as they're doing it, it's like, don't forget to do this, remember to do this. That's actually a massive prompt now. So we've now stolen that opportunity for the student to think for themselves independently and practice what they've just been doing in that lesson. We've now stolen that from them. And so what ends up happening, right, is that usually we go through these lessons. And again, just keep in mind that, like, right now, I'm talking more from a primary perspective because that's where I've been working, right? And so what happens invariably is we go from lesson to lesson without any learning really happening, where things are being retained, like, and you can't retain something that you never learned in the first place. And so then we keep moving along, we keep pushing along, teachers feeling that time poor and that pressure, and then we get to some sort of assessment. So whether that's a high stakes national assessment, whether it's a summative assessment, end of unit assessment, and then the students struggle there, right? Because what we're doing is firstly, we're asking them to do something for the first time by themselves. So they haven't really, a lot of those students that struggle, they haven't actually had to do anything by themselves up until that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, it's usually some sort of generalization assessment where the students actually have to apply what they know in a novel situation. So, it might be like for maths, most of the time it's like word problems. For reading, it'll be some sort of comprehension task where they're reading a text that they haven't been exposed to before. It might be like if you're writing, they've got to write something based on a stimulus they haven't seen before. And so this is now asking them to generalize the skills that they've learned, and to generalize, that is a lot harder. And I think intuitively we all know that, right? That to apply your knowledge in a situation that you haven't been put in before, that is a lot harder to do than just doing something in the same sort of situation. So it's like if we're talking about sport, I might be able to, to dribble around a few cones, and I can do that effectively. But then to do that in a game sort of situation, that's always going to be a lot harder. There's a lot more unpredictability, right? And so that's what like an assessment, that sort of high stakes assessment is like for a student. It's like being in that sort of game situation where it's more unpredictable. And so you've got to apply more things that you know. Okay. And so this is now where contingency adduction starts to come into it, is that rather than getting to that point where we're asking students to apply what they know, whether it is in class, whether it's in an assessment, we can actually engineer that learning process up to that point a lot better. And I know that most schools in America are fairly similar to schools here in Australia, in the sense that there are some missing pieces in most classrooms. And one of those big missing pieces is actually fluency practice. So what we know about learning, right, is that it gets harder when, and you mentioned John Sweller, Professor John Sweller, that you've spoken to, and people like Paul Kirshner and Kyle Hendricks, and those sorts of people, right? They talk about how our working memory is limited, and so understanding that our working memory is limited, we've got to try to make it as easy as possible for our students to pay attention to the main thing. And we also want to, like, if we've got some sort of multi-step problem that they need to complete, whether that is like a maths word problem or a reading comprehension task, like when you break that down, it's actually made up of lots of little sub-skills. So if you think about, say, a maths word problem, the students need to firstly have that ability to decode the words. They need to be able to then read fluently. They need to be able to understand what they're reading. So they need that background knowledge and vocabulary. They need to then understand what the question's asking them. They need to understand, they need to be able to recognize the numbers as well within that question. They need to be able to know how to put that, into some sort of number sentence that they can use. So they need to have like what we know is like an attack strategy to go through that word. So there's so much, right? And so invariably what happens is that we give, we might say to our students, all right, we're going to do some problem solving tasks now in maths, and we'll give them this activity. And what happens is, because a lot of our students haven't got fluency in a number of those sub skills, they really struggle. Okay. And so, yeah, we have some students that are able to do that problem or, complete those activities, but a lot of our students actually, the gap just widens because they fall flat on their face, because they don't know the simple things, like they firstly, they can't even read the question, or they haven't got fluency in their basic maths facts. So yeah, this is why I couldn't be a bigger advocate for fluency practice. And when I'm talking about fluency practice, it's like it's intentional, it's timed, and it's to see, are we improving or not? It's not to see who's at the top, who's the fastest in my class, but it's to see, like, is this intervention, and we'll call the practice the intervention. Is this intervention actually working? Are we seeing improvements? And yeah, only then, like once you kind of get this up and running, will you start to see those gaps close, because this is really what is holding a lot of students back. And Kent Johnson, he's a founder of Morningside Academy. I don't know if you've heard of Morningside Academy at all.
No.
I encourage you, if you want to know, like, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, really it comes from his work and Morningside Academy. And so what he talks about is how, like, without fluency, it's like climbing a mountain with a bag of bricks on your back. So, doing these kind of multi-step problems, or even like a reading comprehension task, or writing, a piece, that they all require so many different things to be called upon. And so if we haven't got fluency in any of those things, we're making a tricky task even more difficult. And so, if we can start to embed fluency practice, and it can be as little as 5 minutes a day, it just shows like massive improvements. And so, if students are able to have that fluency, and if teachers, like I said, are able to actually engineer it in a way where we know where students are at, like what they've got fluency in, then we can actually be intentional with when we present them with different problems, because we actually know, they've got like the prerequisite stuff down pat, they've got fluency in that. And so now when I give them this problem that I haven't explicitly taught them how to do, they're actually going to they're likely to be successful, because they've got what they need in order to complete that.
And I think if I'm reading you correctly, that at that point, then they might sort of have that aha moment, which you're sort of equating or labeling sort of discovery, right? And I think it's important to talk about terms and commonality of terms. If you think about one end of the spectrum being discovery, free learning, which is totally unguided, students or learners just learning on their own without any real teacher guidance. And on the other end, the opposite of that, where there's a lot of teacher guidance and very little student autonomy. And so the idea of discovery is that in your piece, and I think what you're talking about here, and again, this is what Barbara Oakley said, and I might phrase it a little bit differently, and I think there's some ways in which inquiry shows up that are a little bit different from this. But when I think about inquiry, I am kind of thinking about the ways in which we lead the learning and provoke the thinking and learning that we're after. And I think it's important to distinguish between thinking and learning, right? Because and the different kinds of thinking and learning. And so how do we create the conditions and the pieces, and lots of times it's scaffolding, and there, I think there's some other things that might be involved in that, to get the student to have that moment of, oh, I get it. Oh, right. And a lot of the cognitive science, and a lot of this, I think, tends to sort of land and live in the sort of math world, or you'd say maths, but fluency is important in other places. I was working with a school just yesterday on project-based learning, and we were talking about instructional principles and how do we scaffold, what are the assessment pieces, and how do we check for understanding, and consistently check for understanding all the time, not just at the end of the week or something like that. And I think it's we want to make sure that we're doing all of the things that we can to scaffold and bring them to the moments where they can have those discoveries. But I was mentioning, talking about fluency, it doesn't have to be just math. It can be, I taught social studies at the high school level, and you wouldn't expect high school students to be able to think and do much with federalism and the separation of powers and our democratic principles if they don't know them well, because they might have to stop and go, "Boy, what does the judicial branch do, or what does the executive branch do, or what's the difference between state and federal?" Those kinds of things. And there's a fluency level there that I think is really important that you're mentioning, right? And can help you get to some of those moments of aha, or figuring things out on your own, quote unquote. But you sort of provoked that thinking. And I think it's Bruce Robertson, who I love his work on questioning, and he's been on the podcast. He's got a new book he's working on. He'll be back on. But I think he talks about it in terms of desirable thinking. I might have it the terminology wrong, but that's the idea, is how do we really clearly identify what we want students to think and learn about. And for me, I want them to think in certain ways, right? And I might want them to memorize certain things. I might want them to evaluate or analyze, and those are different kinds of thinking moves. And then what do I want them to learn about, and which of those might be surface, deep, or transfer, or whatever framework you might want to use. And then, like you said, so what are the instructional moves to do that? How do I set them up for success in doing that? And as I was talking with this group yesterday, and we're talking about project-based learning, and for me, project-based learning there is significant and should be significant scaffolding, and I'm very critical of people who say, let's do project-based learning, and it's something more like, well, the kids can figure it out and they don't need knowledge and things like that. I'm wondering, though, we actually referenced and talked a little bit about the instructional hierarchy in the work yesterday with that group. Do you see that living more in the sort of math and sort of hard science kinds of, I don't know how you describe it, things that build upon each other, as opposed to, something that's a bit more conceptual and abstract, like a humanities or, based social studies and things like that? Because it seems to me like it naturally finds a home. Like, we want students to acquire and then get through those instructional hierarchy stages in math, but not necessarily does it seem quite as clear or easy to make that association with something that's a bit more abstract.
Yeah, look, good question, and I think it's important to talk about those other topics, because it just helps people kind of frame it a bit better. And it definitely applies to anything and everything, right? Like the instructional hierarchy, it applies to when you're learning anything, and it doesn't matter how old you are. Like if we're adults and we're trying to learn something new, we still go through those stages of learning. If you're a child, you still go through those stages. And there are a couple of things I want to touch on about it, because I do see, as more people learn about it, they probably don't quite understand some of the nuances involved. It probably seems simpler on the surface level than it actually is, right? So, so some ways I've seen this kind of misinterpreted is that you think you've got a unit of work, and it doesn't matter what subject, and you think at the start of the unit there are acquisition, and then we're going to move along until we get, by the end of the unit, they should be at adaptation. So that's not how it works either. I prefer to look at each of the stages kind of like separately, because we actually almost want them operating separately within the classroom, within school. So most of the time, your students are actually sitting in that acquisition stage of learning, and that's why I do talk a lot about explicit instruction, because the way that our curriculum works is that we're going from lesson to lesson teaching new things. So anytime you are teaching something new, then your students are going back into that acquisition stage of learning. They don't know that yet. And the only students that may know the things that you're teaching are students with that social capital, right? And that's why, it can be dangerous if we use the wrong tools at the wrong time, where we ask too many kind of inquiry-based questions when we know students are at that acquisition stage of learning. Like that's where we just got to teach them what they need to know, right? And so all of those like little things that you're kind of referring to in a humanities or social sciences type of topic, right? We can still teach that stuff to them. Okay, so even like the ways of thinking. So in writing, there's a great organization out there called, they used to be Think SRSD, just changed to releasing writers. And so they follow like these self-regulated strategy development writing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with their work at all.
No.
And so there's all of these different mnemonics that students are taught that they can then use when they're writing. Okay, and same in maths. Like there's attack strategies where if you follow, like understand the problem, plan what you're going to do, answer the question, check it, like that sort of thing. Like if we give our students these sorts of problem-solving strategies, then they're actually going to be more likely to be able to use them when they get there. So we're trying to give them all of those skills that they need when they actually have to do that kind of higher order thinking activity that brings lots of things together. Now, yeah, the other aspect as well is that it's not like we go from, we've got our lesson, and then at the end of that lesson, we're going to like do some fluency practice on what we've just done. The fluency is more about fluency on especially your tool skills. So I mentioned it a little bit in the article, where so the three kind of categories we have are like tool skills, component skills, and composite skills. So your composites is like that's like the end goal, where they're bringing in like lots of these different bits of knowledge and skills. And the tools are like the things that you need to be fluent with in order to be able to do that composite skill effectively. So your tools at that, like the basic level, it's things like your basic maths facts. It's being able to read sentences, construct a sentence if you're writing, like, so those real kind of basic things that if you can't do fluently, then that's going to really hold you up, and you're going to have to think quite hard about that. And then we have the components where fluency can help there, but as long as they've actually had instruction on that, or they've got a history of learning that, then they're going to be able to call upon that as well, because the composite is going to be pulling upon different tools and components. Now, where this kind of gets a bit tricky is that there's like nothing stays a tool, nothing stays a component, nothing stays a composite, because as you get better, as you learn more, then what is today's composite skill could be tomorrow's tool skill. Yeah, and that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about, like, right now I'm kind of framing it from a primary perspective, but as you move into that secondary space, like the majority of what our kind of composite skills are in the primary space will then become, or should be, your tools and your components. But the issue that we're seeing in the secondary space, and this is what I experienced, was that those things that those things that should be fluent tool skills in secondary they're not fluent with them a lot of the times. So if you ask any high school maths teacher, what do you wish your students came into high school with? Hands down, they all say fluency with their times tables.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. And so that's what I mean, is that at the moment, we're just not getting that level of fluency in the tool skills. And so then we're not actually building on, when students are getting into high school, they haven't actually got, fluency with many things at all, if anything. And so then everything just becomes more complex and harder for them. And so coming back to your original point, just around, like, how does this apply in social sciences and humanity? Well, that's whether you're reading, whether you're writing, you're still doing those things. Okay, you're still having to think about something. So, like you mentioned, and that was a perfect example, right, where there are going to be bits of content that you need to know, like, fluently, because you need to think about them quite easily. Like they're the foundational things. So it doesn't matter what subject you're coming from, if there are like those foundational things that you're going to be looking at a lot, or everything else kind of relies on. It's like, your foundational layer of bricks. What are those things that if they're missing, then nothing else, we can't build anything else on them. Then they're your tool skills. They're the things that we've got to build fluency in first. And again, like if it's needed in that secondary space, then that's what we've got to do is actually give them fluency practice as well. And often we can, like, when I talk about this stuff with secondary teachers, they often have this perspective that there's certain tools that we use in primary that are just for primary. So things like fluency practice, that can be frowned upon. Things like using mini whiteboards, choral responses. So they think that, that's just for little kids, when in actual fact, like, if you actually understand the reason behind why we do those things, it's because we just want to maximize the amount of practice opportunities that they're getting in a certain time. And then we want to know, as a teacher, we want to know, are they understanding what we're trying to teach them? And then we can give them some feedback. Whereas if we just kind of wait until the end of the lesson, that's going to be too much length in time between when we give that feedback. So I know I've just gone a little bit off topic here, but bring me back.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned choral response, and that I think is a good connective tissue to one of the things that I worry about, because there's different ways to think about knowledge, and fluency is obviously really important. I agree with you, and knowledge is really important, but there's different kinds of knowledge, right? And like the idea of memorizing something and knowing something, and the ways in which you can know it but not necessarily understand it, or understand it in a way that makes sense in certain contexts. And give you an example that maybe makes some sense here. I was listening to a podcast actually earlier this morning, and it was talking about the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and one of the things
really interesting.
I almost didn't keep listening, but it kept getting better and better. And one of the things that really jumped out to me that I had never thought about, and I thought was really interesting dynamic and sort of concept, was the guest was certainly, he had worked with Merriam as an organization, that and figuring out what words go in, and how, all of the stuff that goes in the etymology of words. But he also had some experience working with Scrabble. I guess there's a work you can do in Scrabble. I don't know. Again, out of my wheelhouse, but he was an avid Scrabble player. And what they discussed was the distinction between knowing a lot of words that might be useful for Scrabble, but you wouldn't need to know any of the etymology or meaning of those words. Essentially, Scrabble in that sense is almost like a math equation. Like, you're trying to fit words in, and you have this bank of words that you can use, and you're trying to score points. And it doesn't, you could put words in there that you have no idea what they mean, right? Which is different from how we use language and speak and write and all the things, right? And where it is really important to know the meaning. And I thought that was really interesting, because how does that sort of compare to knowledge that we learn in schools and the knowledge that we teach, and how do we not be limited? And I worry about this from either it's a messaging problem, or maybe an actual problem, and maybe it's both in the individual teachers and educators. But there's such a focus on knowledge and using explicit instruction to build that fluency, or build that understanding, or build that knowledge, or whatever they might call it, and sometimes an outright rejection on anything other than that. And inquiry is bad, and again, we're back to the us versus them binary thinking. And so they might be building knowledge that is in the brains and can be retrieved, change in long-term memory. So there's learning, but is it connected, right? And maybe another way to put it is, and it's not quite the right analogy, but I think when you're talking about sport, the way you're talking about dribbling around cones, I'm assuming soccer, but maybe basketball. Was it soccer?
Yeah, but we could be talking about basketball as well.
Yeah. Well, so I coach soccer, and one of the things that, if you've coached any sport, and soccer is certainly no different, is that as you work in practice and work on drills, you can drill. You want to move it up and then back and then around, and all of those things, and it can look wonderful in drills. And then, as you mentioned, you get in the game, and it's a much, much different scenario, right? And actually, somebody on our coaching thread asked, I've got 9 or 10-year-olds, and they do great in the drills about not just kicking the ball, right? 9, 10-year-olds are famous for just playing kickball. And we do great in practice, and they get in the game and they just kick it. And so I said, well, it could be a number of things, but one of those things is it could be that they've reached the point of cognitive complexity. The challenge is too high, right? The game is moving too quickly. And so they're not able to process all of the things that you might want them to process in order to make the right decision. They're just boom. And I guess you could call that fluency. I don't know. But it strikes me as an interesting, again, sort of example, and maybe not the perfect analogy, but like making sure, how do we make sure that teachers understand and think deeply about the different kinds of knowledge, and the way that there's schema building knowledge, and then there's connected knowledge, and those things are related but not the same. And we don't want them, just like we don't want teachers to use inquiry and overload students with cognitive load and put them too far out of their depth. We also don't want them to limit the window of what the students are learning to this sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, limited sort of sense of knowledge. So I'm curious, how you think about that.
Yeah, look, I think I pretty much agree with what you're talking about, and it's more a teacher knowledge issue, isn't it? Or a translation in the messaging, the correct messaging, where and like the way I kind of think about it is that at the moment, teachers firstly aren't necessarily getting set up for all of this this complex job. They're not getting set up for effectively through initial teacher education. We know that's happening pretty much worldwide, right? And so then secondly, the issue is that then teachers just want to know what to do. And so like coming back to that idea of how adults, teachers also go through these stages of learning. And so most of the time, like they're also not getting to that level of fluency in what they're doing in like being able to understand how everything connects and the why behind it. Like I think that's kind of the issue that we're talking about here, is that students and teachers don't actually understand the why behind things that they've learned. So they might just learn what to do, so the soccer player learns how to dribble, but they don't know like why they're learning to dribble that way or how to apply that in the context of a game. Drew, I might have to prick your brain later for coaching tips, because I've just put my hand up to coach my daughter's soccer team. So
careful what you wish for.
Yes. And so yeah, like the issue is that same for teachers, right? Is that when we introduce a new program or we give them some professional learning, they don't really get past that surface level of understanding about what they're doing, and so they get to applying it. They've got this new program, they're going through the program, but of course the program's not going to tell them absolutely everything that they have to do, and that requires like the teacher to understand like what's happening and why they're doing different things. And so we end up just kind of having teachers saying, oh, well, that doesn't work, that we've got lots of slides being used here in Australia, it's just death by PowerPoint again, or
unfamiliar.
Yeah, but before it was textbooks, right? It's the textbook, but that's just a tool, right? That's not the problem. The problem is that the teacher doesn't know how to use that tool correctly, and the slides or the textbook, that should just be your holding spot of information for what you might present in your class. But that doesn't do the teaching for you. As a teacher, that's what you need to be doing. You need to be explaining, like when I teach you how to do this, like this is why I'm teaching it to you. Like we need all of that knowledge. I completely agree with you. It's not I don't think anyone who kind of properly understands this stuff is saying like, you just need to know your facts, or like you need to know the why behind it as well. But you can't think about the why if you can't recall the fact in the first place, right? So that's why that fluency piece is just so important, is that it actually allows us to think deeper and to transfer and to apply and to do those sorts of things. We can only start to do that when we've got a base to work off, not just kind of hoping that things will work. And I think that's probably where the inquiry approaches have gone wrong in the past, is that they haven't been as strategic or intentional with the design that happens before the task. And I feel like it's still probably more that sort of teacher knowledge issue, where teachers actually don't have the knowledge themselves to unpack a lot of those things. And like naturally, as a teacher, it's actually easier for me just to present an activity and then say, all right, have a go at this, see what you can do. Like in primary, the big issue we have is a lack of content knowledge, because you've got to be a expert in every subject, which is next to impossible. And so what do? You get to a point, and humanities, history, geography, like they're the perfect topics that we do this for. Is I've run out of time. I haven't actually had time to learn about the history of this topic. And so, I'm just going to give them an activity, like a research task. Off you go, guys. You see what you can figure out. And so that's what we end up seeing. And this is why it doesn't work, is because the teacher hasn't been intentional with what actually happens in the lead up to that task. It's like we just throw them in the deep end, and then of course you're going to have a few that are able to do it, and then we give ourselves a pat on the back for that. But then we have all these other stragglers that just haven't got the prerequisite subskills down pat.
Yeah. Are you familiar? Have you seen? There's a paper from Kalyuga and Singh that talks about rethinking. I think the title of it is "Rethinking the Boundaries of Cognitive Flow Theory and Complex Learning." Slava Kalyuga and Anne Marie Singh. And what I found really interesting about that is that I think, if I'm reading it right, and I tried to reach out and have one of them on the podcast, but didn't get a response. But and if they're listening, come on, join us. The idea of that complex learning and kind of moving past just that schema building, which is certainly important. I don't want to dismiss that, but they suggest sort of moving past that dichotomy and seem to recognize what I think is true, but a lot of folks on the sort of more science of learning, cognitive science side will argue with me about, especially at younger ages, that there is real value in skillfully, and I'll add that qualifier there because it can be done poorly, just like explicit instruction can be done poorly, but using inquiry before getting to explicit instruction and knowledge building. And Jared Cooney Horvath calls this the Hollywood effect, sort of setting the scene and perhaps, building some interest. I think that can be really important. But for me, it also serves, if you do it well, and again, there's a big qualifier there, using a question that can sort of frame the learning that's going to be happening. And for us, project-based learning, we have a driving question, and that facilitates a need to know list. What do we need to know and learn in order to do this and answer this question? And you need to be skilled at writing the question and using the question. But so in a professional learning setting, like yesterday, I was working with these teachers and sort of drilling down into the instructional principles and scaffolding and things like that. And so using a framing question like, how can we ensure the thinking and learning that we want, that we're after, to then say, or what do we need to know? And I led them through thinking, let's clarify what we mean by thinking and learning. And what does the instruction look like? What are your principles of instruction? Let's look at Rosenshine's principles of instruction. Let's look at different ways. Let's look at the instructional hierarchy. Let's think about the ways in which inquiry can work and when should you use those kinds of things? And then what are the different ways in which we can assess? Because it gives, in my mind, it gives the opportunity to do some of that leading of the thinking and provoking the thinking. And I think if you can use it well, sort of provide I don't know if mental map is quite the right terminology, but something visual, almost in your head, to then hang that knowledge on, right? Because we want, you used an example about climbing the mountain with the bricks. I've used to sort of come on the example of closing the gap of where you are and where you want students to be, and how can we add more friction there? Because the heavier the cognitive load, the slipperier it is. And what can we do that might add more friction, or almost like what are those walking sidewalks in airports, right? Where you're moving much more quickly over the same amount of space. And to me, inquiry and interest and motivation and sort of the mental map that you can create can help with that. So I'm curious how that lands with you, and especially at the elementary, primary levels.
Yeah, well, the way that you've kind of described it isn't really how I see it being played out in classrooms.
Right. So skillfully, it was the qualifier.
Yeah. So the way I kind of see it is that when teachers start with that big question, they will present it to the students, and then they will see what they can figure out for 10 or 15 minutes, and then they'll come in. And often it hasn't really been thought about, like what that prerequisite knowledge is, like to understand that, and whether or not students have that So that's why, yeah, more often than not, when I've seen it, hasn't actually worked well. What you're describing.
So you're saying that they haven't figured out the academic content that they want them, the sort of cognitive terrain that they want them to, or should want them to traverse?
Well, they might know it, but they haven't thought about what aspects the students currently know and what they will be able to, whether or not they'll be able to actually engage with that question, and or how many students will be able to engage with that question. So it's probably a bit of the teacher suffering from the curse of knowledge, where you know so much, it's hard to kind of get in that headspace of a novice. So most of the time, when I've seen it, it doesn't land well because of that. What you're describing, I would completely agree that we motivation does play a big part in all of this. Like, if you're not, like, at the end of the day, we can talk about cognitive load and the importance of paying attention, but if the students, the learners, aren't motivated to pay attention, they're not going to pay attention.
Right.
So we've got to help them create those connections. The scenario that you spoke about, like that is doing exactly that, is creating connections for your professional learning session. But also keep in mind that those participants, they do have a great deal of background knowledge, that they know things, and so you can do an activity like that, and it's going to help them make those connections. They can engage with it. It's when we ask these questions, and then the students, they have no idea what it is that you're talking about. That's when it doesn't work, and that's when we're wasting time, and when a lot of our lessons can kind of fall flat is just because we don't pitch it right. But the connections need to be made, and there's a little bit of you checking their understanding at that point as well. When you ask a question like that, you're just kind of seeing, like, where are they at? Like, I've got no dramas at all with doing something like that, where you're and I would in fact encourage it, to make sure that, like, whatever your end goal is, like, you need to make sure where your students currently are at, what they currently know, before you try to build on from there.
Yeah, I was talking in my conversation with John Sweller. We discussed this a little bit, and he phrased it. I tend to use cognitive complexity because I think that's what you're getting at here, is the cognitive complexity of what we're asking students to do. And if it's too big of a question, they're just sort of wandering about intellectually. He used the term element interactivity, right? So the ways in which the different elements that we're asking them to think about are just too cognitively complex. And so that is one of the things that I said is, and teachers, really great teachers, are really perceptive, right? First of all, they've thought about the landscape, the terrain that we want them to travel, the students to travel, and anticipated it. And part of that is, as you mentioned, having fluency in content. And one of the teachers yesterday, she said, this is my first time teaching this grade level, and I'm really struggling because I don't know enough. And I said, well, that's a problem, right? And you don't know the questions that need to be really anticipating. You should be anticipating, and the misconceptions and the common things and the big things, right? And so really being clear about that ahead of time, and that's a problem with teachers as well, partly because maybe knowledge or skills, but and experience, but also time and ability to focus and plan and do those things. And we all know that teaching is not exactly ripe with ample extra time. And so then how do we use those? How do we know that this question is going to not be too much or not be too little? And I can really sort of use it to prime the pump. And part of that is the perception, which is checking for understanding, checking for thinking. And that gets to the sort of making meaning pieces of how do we, again, move from just knowledge, which is knowledge building, to making meaning. What a teacher says this word is, or this concept is, versus how do I make meaning of it? And then giving students opportunities to do that. And then, as you said, sort of checking for understanding. It's a really complex problem. It's a really complex process as a teacher. So there's not a question there. I'm just sort of reacting to what you said. And if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, look, I think like the one thing I will add, right, and I haven't probably been really clear with this, is that I have obviously I've found a lot of the cognitive science research really useful, but where I've kind of now started to shift a lot of my learning is actually more from the behavior analysis side of things. And the reason why I find that really useful as a teacher is because it's based on observational things. Okay, so it's like it tells me exactly what I can be doing in the classroom. Like when you see this happening, this is what you should be doing. And this comes back to that analogy I was using at the start around knowing what tool to use when and why. So like when you're seeing your students are in that frustrational stage, and you know, that's the truth, right? That is where they are at, where if they don't know how to do things, if they're showing disengaged learning behavior, that's when we need to intervene, and we need to give them more scaffolds, more prompting, more support. And then the important part is that we're fading that away over time, you know, so that that's based on accuracy. That's not based on you know, the next slide or the next question, but it's based on, here, I've asked them to do something, and then have they got accuracy? Have they shown me that? If so, I'm going to keep fading away. If not, I'm going to keep that support up, or I'm going to go back and I'm going to show them, explain it another way. So we're doing that. But then as we see that accuracy increase, all right, then yeah, that's definitely where you know, we're being strategic with what bits of knowledge. And again, this is where there's so much research out there about how we can be actually really intentional with if you tick these boxes and you get fluency in all these different areas, they're going to be able to do this other stuff. And that's essentially what that contingency reduction is that I'm talking about, right? Like it's an actual term, and the reason why I wanted to you know, to bring it out there to more expose it to more teachers is because I find it's useful in the sense that it's now giving us a bit more like explicit guidance around like what you can be doing, when you can be doing it, why you can be doing it, and starting to think about, you know, when you're instructionally designing your sequence of learning, you're thinking really specifically about, well, okay, this is where I'm trying to get to. This is, you know, my composite skill. What are those component and those tool skills that students need to have before they can do this one? And then we're going to backwards map it from there. And then that way we can actually, you know, be really strategic and intentional with how we get to that end goal. And like I said before, if we design learning in this manner, we end up getting more opportunities to do a lot of the things that you're talking about. The issue why a lot of teachers end up not really getting there is because they're not doing anything as effectively as they probably could, you know. And so we end up in these spaces where teachers feel like you know, by the time they get to, you know, the upper primary grades, they could have like any combination of 5 or 6 different like varying levels of students in front of them. And so they're like, well, what do I do here? Because you know, I've got these students here, they don't even know, you know, they can't read fluently, or they haven't got their times tables. And then I've got these other students, they're operating at like a year 8 or 9 level in maths, and I don't even know how to, you know. So if we end up with this massive range, and so then yeah, nothing is really getting done as effectively as it could be. So it's just more about like the thing I just want to really reiterate is that it's just about teachers being firstly, yeah, building up their knowledge base around how learning happens, and being understanding of like there's actual data that we can use. So rather than going off vibes, you know, like this is what I feel like, you know, this is what I like to do as a teacher, or this is what you know, I think we should do. You know, it's a sunny day today. Let's go and do this. Rather than going off your vibes, actually go off the data of right, this is where students are at. This is what the information is telling me. This is what I'm going to do next. And then if we can kind of be more evidence informed in that sense, then we're going to see less of our lessons failing. We're going to see less of our students failing. Naturally, when we see more success from our students, like as teachers, we feel better. You're going to have less teachers like me leaving the profession at different points in time. So we just kind of, we get in that positive loop rather than that negative loop, where we end up spiraling because we just feel so frustrated as teachers because nothing kind of works for us. So yeah, it's just all about having a stronger understanding about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then yeah, more of your lessons are going to stick.
Yeah. And again, it's so much of a challenge. It's a challenge. You say you do professional learning, I do as well, and the limited opportunities we have to work with schools and their limited opportunities to work and really engage in intellectually rigorous thinking and reflection and practice and formative assessment on their work and things like that. But we're not going to solve any of those problems here in this conversation. I'm mindful of time, Brennan. Are there any things that you want to say or mention? Anything you want to talk about before we jump off? And if not, then anything you want to share as far as your links and places that folks should find you?
Sure. Yeah. Look, once again, thank you for having me on today. I love having these sorts of conversations. Where we actually kind of try to get to the heart of what the issues are in education. I think we've probably landed more in a very similar spot than a different one. For me, like the thing I want to leave with teachers is that firstly, don't put too much pressure on yourself to get it all right every lesson. If anything, just focus on like getting one thing right at a time, and it's all about those small incremental improvements. So get your head around one thing, work on that. Like teaching such a complex thing, we've spoken about so many different ideas today, but really, like in the realities of the classroom, it's if you can just get one of those things right, or one lesson a day right, you're slowly kind of getting onto that stage where you're going to get a bit of a roll on, build a bit of momentum. If people want to know more about me, I am also the host of the Knowledge for Teachers podcast, where I'm also fortunate, like Drew, to have lots of great conversations with people. I work with system schools and teachers around mainly Australia and New Zealand. So people can get in touch that way as well on social media, mainly Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And then that's probably about it. Thank you for having me.
And we'll put the Substack link in there as well. And I'll echo, one of the things that I think is really important is to practice your craft and figure out, getting the basics right. And as much of an inquiry and project-based learning advocate as I am, I will often say is like, if you are trying to do that and you're not building actual learning and knowledge building and the skills that are fundamental to, I think most people would say a successful life, you should probably focus on those things and, scale back on some of those sort of more complex things that inquiry and project-based learning can be. But I also want to make sure that people understand, at least my vision of that inquiry and project-based learning is quite a bit of guidance and quite a bit of structure. And I lock horns with Paul Kirshner, who says, inquiry is discovery learning, and conflate those two. And we can argue about those things, but there's a spectrum there. And we want to make sure that what it is that you're trying to accomplish is matching the approach and the work that you're doing as a teacher. Anyways, we'll leave it at that. Brennan, it has been a pleasure, and thanks for joining me in the conversation.
Thank you.